Antlers of Water. This new anthology, which is absolutely wonderful to boot, brings together 21 writers and 2 visual artists who reside or have resided in Scotland, writing about topics as diverse as, to quote Kathleen Jamie's introduction, the realities of our times, our relationship with our fellow creatures, our beloved and fast-changing landscapes, our energy futures, our ancient past. We're joined tonight by a terrific trio of writers, and I really hope you enjoy the discussion. In alphabetical order, please welcome Karine Polwart, who is a prolific engine of creativity as a songwriter, musician, theatre maker and writer. Her solo theatre show Wind Resistance won Best Music and Sound Award at the Critics Awards for Theatre in Scotland in 2017. Last year, she released the acclaimed album Scottish Songbook and is, in 2020, Artist in Residence at the Royal Botanic Gardens. Next up, please welcome Chitra Ramaswamy, who is a writer and journalist. In 2016, her first book, Expecting: The Inner Life of Pregnancy, won the Saltire First Book of the Year Award and was shortlisted for the Polari Book Prize in 2017. And please can we also welcome Amanda Thomson, who's a visual artist and writer whose A Scots Dictionary of Nature was published in 2018. She lives in Glasgow and Strathspey, and a lot of both her artistic work and her writing concerns the Highlands. So those are our trio of excellent writers this evening. Welcome to one and all. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
We didn't actually discuss who was going to go first, but since I introduced you alphabetically, I guess we could just go in that direction if that's okay with you guys. Yeah, that's grand. So we're going to begin with you, Karine. Is that all right? You're on mute, Karine.
Hello.
Hello.
Great, okay. Well, my name's Karine Polwart, and normally most of my work is as a musician and theatre maker. So apart from anything else, I was delighted to be asked to be part of this anthology as a writer, because that hasn't happened very often. And yeah, but I knew that I wanted to contribute something from the point of view of a musician and songwriter and composer. And obviously there's been this massive swell of nature writing in prose and poetry form, especially I think over the past 10 years. I mean, it's been building for many decades, but I think over the past 5 or 10 years. And that's been kind of matched by a comparable movement in music, and in particular in the folk scene, and here in Scotland in particular, there's just been a groundswell of new work that's place-based and dealing with ecological themes. And I could name dozens and dozens of my pals and peers who are making really beautiful work. Down in the southwest, folks like Stuart McPherson and my friend Beth Porter, who's based in Wigtown, both really deeply inspired by land and place. And people as diverse as Duncan Chisholm and as a fiddler in the north, Julie Fowlis from the Gaelic tradition, Jenny Sturgeon up in Shetland just released a beautiful album inspired by Nan Shepherd's The Living Mountain. So there are dozens and dozens of folk musicians writing in connection with nature and environment. So I thought I'll contribute something from that point of view. And one of the people who's been making really beautiful work over the past 6 or 7 years is my dear pal and neighbour. I can see the back door of her house from the window of this room. And she's also my bandmate. She's called Inga Thompson, and she's from Fair Isle. And she's obviously, she grew up in Fair Isle, which is a tiny, tiny island. I think less than 60 inhabitants right now, a lot of whom are Inga's family and extended family and friends. And a few years ago, she made a beautiful project in collaboration with her cousin, whose name was Lisa Sinclair. She was a poet and musician from Fair Isle, fantastic writer and performer, and was living at the time on Fair Isle. And the project was called The Fishing Hands. And the fishing hands are the fishing grounds of Fair Isle. And there's a beautiful oral culture of passing information from generation to generation and from fisher to fisher about how to identify which fish you can catch where and which fish are spawning in which parts of the Isle. But it's done, it's traditionally been just orally passed as a kind of means of orientating yourself at sea level, as if you were in a boat, from one vantage point to another point by means of kind of triangulation. And these are the fishing hands. And Inga's father and grandfather were fishers, and they were making a piece of work as part of a campaign on the island of Fair Isle to attain maritime protectorate status. And a large part of the argument at national level to argue for that was based on the ecological importance of these fishing grounds round about the islands, and the implications not only for the fish but for the seabirds, because seabirds are so dominant on the island of Fair Isle. And there's the bird observatory up there as a massive part of the culture and ecology of the Isle. So I'll read a little bit of my essay, which is called Find the Ground, and it's inspired by a conversation with Inga about how she made the work with Lisa. But I'll actually begin with how I met Lisa, if that's okay. Okay. When I first met Lisa Sinclair in 2003, she was singing a duet with her mother, singer and historian Anne Sinclair. I'd later stay with Anne on Fair Isle during Inga's wedding celebrations and feed lambs at Lisa's croft with my infant son. But our first connection was 2,000 miles of ocean away at the annual Smithsonian Folklife Festival in Washington, DC. There, in 35-degree heat and 90% humidity, Lisa and Anne conjured the North Sea. Star caverna vestelia, Obadia, star caverna vestelia, Obadia, Monia. It translates as strong blows the wind from the west, O trouble, strong blows the wind from the west, O trouble for the men. It's a song not from Fair Isle, but from Unst, which is the northernmost of Shetland's islands. The Unst boat song is Shetland's oldest surviving song fragment in a mighty lineage of sea songs and lore. And it's sung in Old Norn, an extinct language that leaves traces in modern Shetlandic, Norwegian, and Icelandic. Anne describes the song as a sea prayer for the safe return of the men. The men were, of course, fishermen, as they always have been in these waters. You know the old saying, Shetlanders are fishermen with crofts and Orkney men are crofters with boats. In Shetland, the fishers are the heroes of the seas, the people all the songs were sung about, says Inga. The Unst boat song nods to millennia of fishing culture and economy in Shetland, and the oral knowledge of the fishing hands does too. But Inga says that since she was born in 1974, this means of orientation has become increasingly unreliable. Information about where to find fish was dying out because fishers could no longer be guaranteed a good catch or any catch at all. In 1995, prompted by concern around unstinting damage to the island's ecology, Nick Ridiford, who was then the ranger of the Bird Observatory, led the foundation of FEMETI, the Fair Isle Marine Environment and Tourism Initiative. It was from the outset a partnership between the Fair Isle Bird Observatory, the National Trust, which owns the island, and the Fair Isle community. A broad consideration of the environmental, economic and cultural value of Fair Isle's maritime ecology underpinned FEMETI's commitment to sustainability and collaboration for the benefit of the Isle, its inhabitants, its visitors, and the nation. Part of the way that I've written this essay is that I talk about the campaign for maritime protectorate status on Fair Isle, and I also thread it through with lyrics from Inga and from Lisa. So this is one of their lyrics. It's hard to understand why we need to take more than a living, more than can be held in store, emptying the sea like a river of gold, leaving nothing to the next generation at all. I'll read one tiny little bit that just explains a little bit more about what the fishing hands, what the kind of lore is of fishing hands, and then I'll hand over to Chitra. In 1999, under the auspices of FEMETI, Inga's sister-in-law, Emma Perring, published The Fishing Hands of Fair Isle. With the assistance of Inga's father, Stuart Thomson, his cousin Brian Wilson, and one of the oldest fishers on the Isle, George Stout, Emma compiled an accompanying map, which is a striking visual representation of an ancient oral culture. Orientation points splinter out up to 3 miles from the ragged edges of Fair Isle in a geometric burst of intersecting shards. It's an amazing looking thing. It looks like a burst of, like an explosion or a burst of sunlight on the page. But the names of the fishing hands themselves have their own poetry. The south end of Bunis by Sheep Rock and the east end of Minas seen through the inside of the Burien. The south lighthouse atween the twa homes and the kirk seen through Rund Riva. And they all are like that. They kind of tell you to look one point and then another, and then where these points meet is where the information becomes relevant. And it gives the fishers information about the sea conditions, the conditions of the seabed, and the kinds of fish that may be caught or may be spawning in those grounds. So that's a wee notion of what the fishing hands are, and the essay maps how Inga and Lisa, how they came to write based on interviews with local people and based on scientific data that they had been gifted by the Bird Observatory on the island, and using the scientific data as a visual source of inspiration for writing their melodies. I'll probably stop there. Right now.
Thank you so much, Karine. That was beautiful, and thank you so much for singing the lyrics as well. It's just, it was really is much more evocative than just reading the words. It's just really beautiful. Thank you.
To be honest, I would urge people to. I mean, that just one final point is that the essay is really written as a companion to Inga and Lisa's work, which exists in album form and is really easy to find online and in physical realm. And it's really worth seeking that out. It's called Da Fishing Hands by Inga Thomson, and it's beautiful.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Did you think there's something in your essay about these wonderful oral traditions which are being challenged by changing environmental traditions? But by the time when you get to the end and you're talking about the marine protected area, about the Fair Isle Marine Research Organisation, that it's kind of the people of the island taking back agency, less about stakeholders than folk, in sort of re-establishing new conceptions of the fishing hands, in the future, into the future, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important thing about what happened in Fair Isle. It was the first unanimously community-led initiative to be granted maritime protectorate status. It had every single person who lived on the island supported that campaign, and the project that Lisa and Inga were involved in was a pivotal part of that, because they were interviewing local people who might not be the kind of people that would fill in forms or, be interested in kind of, do you know what I mean? They were the kind of hidden voices, and they felt really strongly, both of them, that all of the voices were important, and that actually art and literature and music are really important ways of potentially engaging with folk that don't connect digitally or don't connect, in more conventional stakeholder ways. They're not the people that will turn up to meetings, but they have got lots of knowledge, and a lot of that knowledge is undocumented. It's oral knowledge, and there is something. There's a parallel between the oral knowledge that's around the ecology and environment of the island and the other forms of oral knowledge which have to do with music and with knitting and other traditional crafts. And I think they had a very clear sense, both Inga and Lisa, that the fragility of the ecology was connected to the fragility of these other forms of knowledge and what value they're considered to have in kind of public discourse. So there's something really powerful, I think, about that knee-to-knee sort of sharing of knowledge and experience, whatever form that knowledge takes.
Great, thank you so much. It's just such a tremendously holistic, and hopeful kind of set of circumstances that you talk about within the essay with the Fair Isle. So thank you so much, Karine. Thank you.
Thanks.
So we'll move on to our second contributor this evening, Chitra Ramaswamy. Hello, Chitra, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm good. It's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to be
in my own house.
It's a wig time state of mind, though. So
exactly.
Your piece is called Three Meditations on Absence in Nature and Life. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it, or read from it if you wish?
Yeah. So I think when we were given such a wide brief, an open brief by Kathleen Jamie, who, is just basically like our goddess of nature writing. So, it is the dream really. And I just felt that, first of all, I wanted to do something that really paid kind of respect and attention to the moment in which we're living. And by that, I didn't then mean the pandemic, because this was pre-pandemic, yet I did end up writing something that, about absence, which suddenly seems so prescient now, because, we are relying so much either on what's on our own doorsteps, or if not that, our memories, places we have been, and kind of almost drawing on that memory bank. And there's something both really powerful and lovely about that, and also there's a melancholy and a sense of what we might have done in going to places so much. So I kind of thought it would be an interesting way into nature writing to write something about places that I haven't been, that might be as powerful as those that I have been to. And of course, by the time the book came out, that was really our experience of the world suddenly. Well, for so many of us, it is about this notion of how we going to love this world, and perhaps see a little bit less of it in order to rescue it from ourselves. So there was, I suppose, a kind of political and social and civic kind of aspect to the essays that I wrote. And also, I really wanted to write something from the perspective of a city dweller. I'm a Londoner. I've always lived in cities my whole life, 10 years in Glasgow, and now the next 10 in Edinburgh. And I really wanted to write something that wasn't about kind of, striking out into the hills, into the most northern reaches of the Highlands, when actually my experience is, I've got 2 young children. My experience of nature is essentially on the daily dog walk, or, in the case of the piece that I'm going to read a little bit from, literally the view out of my own city window, and that sense of nature residing. It's a very Kathleen Jamesian kind of sense of nature writing, in that sense of it residing both everywhere outside of us and also within us too. And the second piece that I wrote is called Pigeon. And it's both about that idea of urban nature and, what could be more humdrum and mundane and unseen than the pigeon, this bird that we've lived alongside throughout human history. But also I wanted to weave in my son's autism, because he's autistic. And it was actually inspired by an essay of Kathleen Jamie's, where she wrote about this idea of nature not just being, the dolphins arcing from the water, but also the cells within our own bodies, or in my son's case, the way that his brain is formed. It's all, I know these are very almost like what you can widen the definition of nature writing so that it almost can become about anything. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to dilute it, but I do think there is room within it for these ideas as well. So I wanted to find a way to kind of admit my son's autism into the pantheon of nature writing as well.
That's absolutely true. Thank you so much. I mean, I think that that's one of the beautiful things about that section, is in terms of what you're trying to do is you're kind of challenging some of what we come to think of as being typically nature writing, in terms of what you did not go on, you didn't reach the end of, but also the kind of ableist or neurotypical version of nature writing as well. And I think it's kind of awesome, to be honest, that you know, the way you describe your son saying he saw specificity, construction, pattern, and I think it's a new and fresh way of looking at the world, which is really actually beautiful. So thank you.
Absolutely, and isn't that exactly what great nature writing is about? Is that kind of close attention and focus, and spending time with something. And again, I thought there were huge parallels between that and the very, very early years of parenting, which are all about a kind of narrowing, a necessary narrowing of your experience and your vision. And, you know, you do have to sit and watch your child pick daisies until you're freezing and you're desperate to go. And you're either going to get angry and resist it and have a terrible time, or you're going to really, really look at a daisy. You know, and so I found also that my own appreciation of what is interesting with nature writing. I don't really consider myself a nature writer at all, and I know to some extent Kathleen Jamie doesn't really see herself as one either. So I think there's I resist those definitions myself, and that's probably why it's my natural response to try and find kind of different ways into it. But will I read a little bit from the start of Pigeon then? Okay.
Thank you.
So this is, as Dave said, there's three, it's a kind of trilogy, a triptych of 3 essays, and this is the middle one, and it's called Pigeon. When my son was about 2 years old, we lived on a busy thoroughfare in Leith. Our flat was directly opposite a police station, and my son liked to stand at the windows and watch the cars parked outside, especially when they turned on their sirens and sped away. The wind that swooped up that street, casting gulls over the rooftops in great arcs, came straight off the Firth of Forth. In winter, it was cold enough to draw instant tears from my eyes and made the street lamps attached to our old building waggle like weather vanes. We stood at the window a lot in those long, indistinguishable days, so much so that certain neighbours looked up as they passed, expecting to see us and waving when they did. Sometimes I felt ignited by the spark of connection. Sometimes I retreated, embarrassed, caught in the act of feeling trapped. One day, as we were standing there, my son watching the cars and me watching the street lamps, a pigeon landed on the windowsill. This was not so unusual. Now and then, a pigeon, though never to my knowledge a gull, would briefly alight on our narrow windowsills, which were 2 floors up above a pub aptly called the Compass. One year, during the winter, I discovered I was pregnant with my son. A pigeon nested somewhere near our bathroom window for long enough that even now, when I replay the dramatic reveal of that little white stick with its shocking pink plus sign, it's accompanied by a warm cooing. But I never saw that pigeon. As the bathroom window was frosted, I only ever heard it, and it was a different time. I was preoccupied with life beyond the walls of my home in those free as a bird days, usually passing through on my way somewhere or other, never homing for long. I did not have children, in other words. That pigeon was incidental. This one, in a time characterized by nothing much happening, was central. It stayed for well over an hour, which is forever when you're on toddler, or one presumes pigeon time. So we stayed put too, and time seemed to stand still with us.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. I like that when you begin to think about the pigeon, the close attention that you bring to it. You say it's like a found object in a gallery. It's pigeonness unfurled. That it's in the slowing down and in the moment you're able to look at it with a sort of increased attention, which both you and your son gain connection over. It's a really beautiful moment.
Thank you.
Can you maybe just tell us a little bit about the other 2 parts to this meditations on absence, the first and the third one, Chitra? Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So the first one is about a trip that that we made as a family when I was heavily pregnant with my second child. And we booked a trip to Applecross, which, you know, everyone loves Applecross. It's kind of, I refer to it in the essay as kind of Scotland's best loved peninsula. And it is because of, peninsulas are interesting anyway, aren't they? Because there's something so stubborn about the way that they kind of jut out from the land. And you always have to go all the way to the end and then come all the way back. And they have a kind of very strong sort of island feel, but they're attached to the mainland. So I like places like that kind of, they're sort of liminal and weird and a bit disarming. And of course, you've got to go over the Bealach Bar to get to Applecross. So it's a kind of impenetrable and difficult place. And all these things I find charming until I'm heavily pregnant. And then you get to the end of the peninsula and you're like, oh my goodness, this is a nightmare. And so again, I did this in my book, Expecting, about pregnancy as well. I'm quite interested in nature writing or a way of talking about nature where you're not necessarily in harmony with it, you're kind of at odds with it. There's a kind of an appreciation for nature in those moments as well, just because, you know, you can feel very pummeled by it. And that's what happened on this particular walk. We tried to do a walk to Ardban, and my son was so young, and I was so heavily pregnant, and it really, my pelvis was just in absolute agony, and the weather was terrible, and we never made it. We never made it to the beach. And instead, I kind of found myself sitting, you know, really dejected on this rock in this tiny little bay that I later found out was called Pol de Bay. And I've probably pronounced that wrong. Karine, you'll have to kind of correct me on how to say that. But it was just a real moment of both kind of defeat, but also real acceptance of, you know, we weren't going to go, and the not going became as kind of important and sort of lodged in my memory as if we had gone. And actually, something important to say about that moment in that essay is I wanted to somehow bring in kind of the idea of the color of my skin and my race, and how, of course, that affects every single aspect of my life, but particularly in nature. You can feel very, very aware of it because, you know, you don't tend to see anyone else who looks like you in those environments. So I thought it would be interesting and a kind of almost like a kind of technical challenge to try and write this entire essay and just have one mention of it. And so I just have one line about how I feel particularly kind of vulnerable and fragile in that moment, and how it makes me, you know, it's always in those moments that I most viscerally feel the color of my skin. And then the final essay was just a kind of afterthought in some ways of, you know, I wanted to write about England. In a book of, again, to kind of, you know, sort of cross through a border as an English person living in Scotland, and this kind of sense of, you know, an understanding of kind of Scotland-based writing around the environment. Well, the fact is, you know, so many people here are English for a start, but the way that we live doesn't really know borders. And, you know, my entire time of living here has been about crisscrossing that border and about kind of belonging to more than one place. So I wanted to write an essay. The last one is about a walk that I didn't do very close to where my parents lived. Actually, my mother died, has recently died. And this essay, there's no way that I could read that out tonight, that's for sure. But it was about her being very, very ill with breast cancer, and a walk that she did on my sister's birthday. And I didn't get to go because I was in Scotland. And so that walk to me is very important for having not gone. So I wanted to write about that as well.
Thank you so much, Chitra. I'm sorry to hear about your mum.
Thank you.
But it's kind of it's lovely that you commemorate her in that essay, and in that segment of the essay, at least anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, she always had a packet of wildflowers in her sari, and she had a real thing about throwing seeds everywhere. So yeah, there's a nice kind of sense of there being, you know, seeds along that little patch of the Thames. I wouldn't know where they were, you know, I wouldn't know if I was looking at one, but I'll always kind of think about them when I go there.
Oh, that's really wonderful. No, and I do appreciate the aspect of, we're migratory creatures. So many families live right across, various borders.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it feels it's very, very in keeping, actually, in thinking about the environment we live in, thinking about the way in which we move through it. It's entirely in keeping with that. So thank you very much. Thank you. So what we might do is, just before I move on to Amanda, the chat box is very quiet. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask any of our wonderful writers this evening, please do stick your questions in the chat box or send them to Isla. I think she's put her email address in there as well. But we'll come to questions in the segment just after the next one. I'm going to turn now to the excellent Amanda Thomson. Good evening, Amanda.
Hey, how are you?
I'm not too bad. Yourself?
Very good, thank you. Very good.
That's great. So your piece is called Among Islands. Sorry, Around Some Islands. Sorry, right. Do you want to tell us a little about that, or to read a little bit from it?
Yeah, I'll do a little bit about both. It's kind of interesting hearing Karine and Chitra talk about their work, because this piece for me is about kind of an extremity. It's a place that I've never been to before, and I'm probably unlikely to go again anytime soon. It's about an island called Mingley that I went to actually about 8 years ago now, and I spend a lot of my time in the Highlands. Now I'm really interested in nature and trees, and sense of place and sense of home is a really important part of my work. And it's interesting having Karine there as a musician in writing. And I suppose I'm an artist, or started off as an artist, but I've veered more towards writing, because what I'm really interested in all of my work is how you find the form that suits how you make sense of where you are or where you've been. And for me, what I've found with writing is it's helped me layer these kind of ways of being and thinking, layering histories, layering experience, and layering all these other things that come in to kind of create the kind of multi-layeredness of place. And I'm aware of, Karine mentioned Duncan Chisholm's work, for example, like how music translates Sandwood Bay, for example, how Lauren McCall's recent album on landscape has this real kind of evocation of the landscapes and things like that. So I suppose I'm really interested in how in this piece it came together just after thinking and reflecting on this one day in this one island, and how these kind of just these moments that you're not necessarily expecting necessarily to really impact on you and sit with you can kind of hold you for a very long time, if that makes sense. So I think maybe what I'll do is just kind of read just a couple of pieces from the piece in Antlers of Water. Within minutes of the boat leaving the harbour at Mallaig, I felt an untethering from ordinary life and place. The song of the whales sailed low and close to the water. The mainland receded only slowly, and any land masses before us only gradually came into focus with an altered point of view. Egg became unrecognisable as egg from the north, and Skye from the southwest became a fortress. Due west, Mingley would emerge over the far horizon, first as a watery presence, only slowly becoming solid. This was an unhurried traversal, hours and hours of watching and looking, flick at skies, no phones, no internet. Shearwater skimmed the waves in black to white to black lines. Posses of guillemots bobbed on the swell and skittered away or ducked under as we passed. Queens of puffins, solitary tasties. I was on a 74-foot long sailing boat travelling around some islands with a group of people, most of whom would remain strangers, while two would become good friends. It's a trip that stays with me, in part because of the experience of slow journeying and hours only slowly unfolding. Days spent sitting, watching, thinking, we must have talked to, but I can't remember any of the specificities of conversations at all. On these islands, the past, the present and future are intimately entwined, and each island offers up all times if we know what to look for. There are abandoned crofts and townships where roofs and walls have fallen and sand and nature or the macher have encroached over doorways and into the crevices between their stones. There are standing stones in prehistoric settlements, peat banks that have been worked for generations, the remains of old field systems that we can see when a low sun casts its shadows, rusting cars and ploughs and tractors, all testament to the longevity of human occupation and influence. On Cana, there's a Celtic cross from around the 8th century, which is broken, so I was told, because it was used for target practice during the Napoleonic Wars. Sailing around Cana towards Mingulay, someone pointed back and spoke of a cave on the west end, on the west side, where the island's boys hid when the press gangs visited. There's a bittersweet tension between humans and nature that is sometimes balanced, sometimes lost. Cana's shearwater population was decimated because of the rats that came to the island, stowaways on boats over a century ago. Since the extermination of all 10,000 of them, the seabird colonies have seen a resurgence. Likewise, the rabbit population, without predation, exploded and was perhaps upwards of 16,000 before thousands were culled in 2014. The rabbits not only affected agriculture on the island, but their burrowing threatened to destroy the archaeological remains of humans who, though long gone, have left traces hidden beneath the surface of the land. These islands hold plants and birds that you would now be lucky to see and hear elsewhere in the UK. Red-necked phalaropes, corn buntings, storm petrels, eagles and divers, of course, and it's in some of these islands that you might be lucky to hear the creks of the corncrake during the summer, calling from the midst of the tall grasses left for that purpose at the edges of fields. On some nights, the gulls adjust their circadian rhythms to match the fishing boats that leave these islands before dawn. In a forest, if you're paying attention, from a still start, you can sometimes hear a breeze approach before it encircles and passes through and over you. In the same way, looking out over the Atlantic from a cliff top, say in Mingulay, or off Store Point in Sutherland, you can see squalls form at sea and watch as they come in and soak you, or reach landfall a little way to the south or to the north. Land lashed. You're sometimes made aware, tangibly, of a near future soon to arrive. Might it be true that we see the future closer here on these islands than in other places?
Very much, Amanda. Thank you very much indeed. There's so much I could ask you about this essay. It's quite, because you see with such fluency across time in islands. I don't know if you'd agree with that statement or not. I don't want to make generalisms. But you know, the evidence of past human activity there is so tangible. But a bit like Karine's piece, you gesture towards the future in the last excerpt you read there as well, and in ways which I think are really interesting. In that islands, you can maybe see the future closer on islands, but they're also kind of ambiguous places in that sense as well, between the past and the future. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I yes and no. I mean, I think it's fascinating to look at Scotland in general. And I think it's been really interesting reading that essay again during lockdown, when we've essentially been in our own islands again. You know, we haven't actually ventured. There's been borders that we haven't kind of, especially when, in lockdown with the 5 mile kind of zone, there were these kind of areas that we couldn't necessarily venture over. So there's something about, I think, containment and actually finding time to stop and listen and look in the same way that I'm writing about Mingulay. There's something about just that pause and that time to spend looking, kind of irrespective of like the stresses and strains and all the other pressures that we've had on us. And I think there's also about that longevity of time where actually if you look, you actually can see the kind of histories of
place. And sometimes it's just kind of having the knowledge in that first place to understand that there's a history of place. So, for example, I'm in the kind of in the middle of the kind of Scots pine woods in Abernethy just now, and there's a really interesting book about Abernethy that's just come out by Ron Summers, and it shows the history of the forest. And while the forest has maybe been here kind of for 1,000 years or more, actually the trees I'm looking at are maybe kind of 50, 100 years old, a lot of them, you know. So there's that kind of, there's a recent past that spills over into a longer past and a longer past and a longer past. And there's so many parts of Scotland and, you know, anywhere where you can actually see that kind of unfurling of time if you know what to look for and if you take the time to look.
But I suppose islands are quite concentrated places as well, absolutely, in terms of the biodiversity, but also in terms of the size is manageable to think with in a way that perhaps why don't you know it's a question of scale, I suppose, in some ways. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, you know, I've never, I mean, unless you call the UK an island, which I guess it is, but I've never lived kind of in a small island with that containment. And I think what I was very aware of in Mingulay, and if you go to the US or the Hebrides, or you know, when Karine's talking about Fair Isle as well, which is one of my go-to places that I've never been to yet, but that idea of this concentrated history that's there through necessity, you know, like the kind of the fishing marks and things like that, or the history of the kind of where the standing stones are and have been, you know, that kind of concentration of time still apparent, I think is there in ways that we don't get kind of in other places. That's good. Thank you so much, Amanda. I think that kind of hits the nail on the head, I think, for me anyway. Thank you so very much. Grand. So what we're going to do now is we do have a concentration of time in this hour, but it's rapidly sort of draining away. So I'm going to turn now to I think what'll I do? Yes, no, I think I'm going to go to audience questions, I think, because we have quite a few fertile ones and we'll see how they spin off, I think, because there are some really fertile ones within there, if that's okay with you guys. So I'm going to go for the, before we began, Amanda, you said I going to ask a doozy of a question. Well, somebody else has got it, so I'm just going to ask it. The Wigton Festival Company, thank you for that, has asked, nature, as Chitra says, crosses borders, so why is it important to create a specifically Scottish collection of nature writing? Silence. It's a doozy of a question. Well, you know, it is really interesting. Yeah. Is it a specific, well, I don't know, Scottish collection? What is a Scottish collection? What do we mean by Scottish? Do you know? I mean, I suppose.
I think there's lots of. I mean, I think there's lots of questions in that. I agree. It's like, is it necessary, and what do you mean by that? And I think what's interesting about the collection for me as a reader of it, never mind as a contributor, it speaks to a lot of what Chitra said, is that it kind of defies the kind of maybe some of the presumptions around A, what nature writing is, and B, who gets to write nature writing, like what perspectives and voices are represented in that. It kind of defies even what you might lazily assume would be a Scottish nature writing collection, because it is so diverse in form and perspective and voice, and yeah, a lots of the lazy assumptions just don't apply. One of the things I think that Kathleen Jamie has said that struck a chord with me, that one of her motivations for pulling it together was that she was tired of reading about Scotland from the perspective of people who literally passed through and glanced off it, and that she wanted to pull together a collection where all of the people, regardless of how you define where they came from or where they live in the country, have an intimate connection with the place, and that might be something that is defining it across the different contributions. I don't know, is that there's a intimacy of knowledge, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I was waiting for the other two to speak as the kind of the non-Scottish person here. I've lived in Scotland for more than half of my life, so I think it is really important actually to create a specifically Scottish collection. Only in the sense of it's like a kind of, it's almost like a sort of document of the times, isn't it? So it's interesting to see a kind of collection of voices and perspectives, and I think the breadth of place is really, really interesting as well. And because there is that kind of historical tendency to sort of sentimentalize nature and environment of Scotland, and what if there is a kind of thread that runs through this that sort of describes what, you know, what Scottish nature writing is, you know, in the second decade of the 21st century or whatever. It seems to me that it's kind of it has a sort of real earthiness to it, and it's a really it's very unsentimental. It's kind of that there's a sort of realism to it, a kind of, we need to look at the world as it is in front of us, and I suppose that probably, you know, then also goes much beyond Scotland as well, because these are questions that, you know, they've become the big searching questions of our age, haven't they, of what we've done to this planet, and how it is responding with this virus. So it is, I think it's an important moment for it, as I think it's valuable to see a collection of kind of Scottish or Scotland based writing together at this moment in time, definitely.
Yeah. I think as well there's a, you know, that kind of phrase to see ourselves as others see us, is kind of, you know, that idea of we're in this country, but within this country there's so many diverse experiences, and it's a small country, but it is very diverse in landscape and place. And what the collection does is there's a kind of, there's an intimacy born from the kind of landform that everybody's writing about. But I think what's really interesting was if Kathleen had asked another 20 writers, or had asked the 20 writers that she asked in 2 years' time or 2 years before, we might be writing about very, very different things as well. Do you know? So it's, in a way, it's almost a primer of looking to what Scotland is and what Scotland has. You know, I think the first chapter on wind farms, for example, you know, like that kind of way of looking at the country from within, but also out with it as well. I think these kind of connections that the book makes, I think, are really important. But it's about connectivity, but diversity within that connectivity, I think, is really important.
I think well said. I think that's really important. And, you know, to come back to one of your own earlier statements, you were talking about how you find the form to make sense of where you are, and I think that there's an awful lot of that going on within the anthology. But I guess also when you get the, you know, it's called writing on the nature and environment of Scotland. Sometimes when you approach the word environment, and, you know, it's everything, and so it feels overwhelming sometimes when you're thinking about environmental crisis. You know, it's everything. But because you have such a diversity of writers in a diversity of locations responding to where they are, you get you're able to break it down in a way which is, as you say, a primer, or which is much more manageable to think along with, I think, perhaps. Great. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another question here. They're starting coming in thick and fast here now. Hang on. Almost all of the wonderful readings this evening speak of nature as other or imply it is non-human. Do any of the contributors see harm in perpetuating this differentiation? So nature is something beyond humans. Is that something that there is harm in? that we're not part of it, I suppose, is the question.
Well, I definitely, in my essay, particularly the one that I read from Pigeon, I wanted to definitely do the opposite of that, because I don't know about harm. I guess we're in a funny moment with nature writing, because it's almost like we've become so much more interested in it, and it's become just a much more kind of mainstream form. But at the same time, we are kind of posited much more against nature, and destroying it in, much more extreme ways than we ever have before. So it's interesting that, I suppose it's not surprising that we've become more and more interested in it. But I do think that nature writing becomes more kind of powerful and interesting, and there's a greater almost like a generosity to it if we allow in kind of, science, for example, or the human as nature, as much as the non-human. So yeah, I am willing to admit that into it. I was a judge on the Nan Shepherd, the inaugural Nan Shepherd Prize that Canongate ran recently to find a kind of new diverse voice in nature writing. And we had some fascinating discussions about this very thing on the panel. Because, some of us were sort of saying, writing about food is nature writing, because food is a product, of nature, or it's not. And that's kind of part of it too. But I do think we can go too far, can't we? And then, almost anything is admitted in. But for me, the human and the non-human are part of nature.
You talk really movingly of your own kind of postpartum body and within your piece as being part of like Shepherd's The Total Mountain, and in terms of the total body, in terms of processes and movements and changes to oneself. So I mean, you challenge that quite definitely, I think, within your own piece.
Absolutely. And my first book, expecting not to go too off topic, but that was specifically about that, was the kind of grand metaphor of that book was about the pregnant body as the living mountain that we can't see inside. So as a kind of natural form, and a kind of exploration of the body as being the same or, comparable to an exploration of a landscape.
Thank you very much.
Karine. Go on, Karine. No, go on.
You sure? I mean, just to say that I'm interested in that too. I mean, I think I'm just what Twitchy just said. Aside from this book, I've written a lot about the connection between women's bodies and my body and landscape, and tried to deliberately bounce those ideas off each other, the well-being of place and land and other creatures, and the well-being of people being inextricably connected, and that similar mindsets that cause harm to each of those different parts of life. That there are similar mindsets at play when things go awry. But I do think we are humans, and we're stuck with our human ways of seeing the world to some extent. I can't remember this. I studied philosophy years ago, and I remember reading this philosopher called Wittgenstein, and there's a classic quote, I think, if a dog could speak, we could not understand it. So it's like there's something about wanting to move as close as possible towards the experience of other forms of life, but being stuck with our own bodies, like we're embodied in this planet as humans. But I'm really interested in how humans are affected by all the other forms of life around them and by the landscape that they live in. And actually, I feel that's a really strongly part of what I write about, and part of what Inga and Lisa were writing about from a fair isle perspective, is that all the culture and the ways that people speak even are influenced by the sounds around them. So I think they're deeply entwined.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I was just going to say, I think in the book, most, if not all the writers, actually, it's more about connectivity than separation. And I think it's the different ways in which we connect in different times, and there's a real kind of feeling of embodiment in terms of that relationship that we have. And I think that idea of connectivity is the thing that kind of links a lot of the pieces in the book, actually. And I think that's a really important part, where we are actually not seeing ourselves as separate, but investigating our connections.
And the messiness of how you make that division between
Absolutely.
what's human and what's non-human. That's really strong in Gavin Francis's piece about the Firth of Forth, and where he talks about the kind of epochs of time that are in the geology of the place, but also the epochs of time that are the consequences, for example, of nuclear power and nuclear waste in that environment. And so it's very, very messy. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the book, is that it's not lazily othering or sentimentalizing.
And that's, I was just about to say, I think again that's that you know, this idea of if there is a Scottish nature writing, that very unsentimental way of, you know, we're not looking at, you know, the remotest, furthest reaches of, you know, uninhabited Scotland here, and, you know, the pristine kind of pine forests, and, you know, that we've come too far, we've gone too far down, you know, we're too far into the Anthropocene age, aren't we? This is where we're at now. We have had a massive influence on this planet, and so the human and the non-human, we are so connected now, as you say, Amanda, and we are kind of, I think in nature writing now, there's just a real facing up to that. And how are we gonna write our way through this?
Oh, thank you. And I think that you know, that's something that all of you have said in different ways about bearing witness to where we are now in all of its connectivity and its diversity. And I think that's something that the anthology does very well to mark, I think. So thank you. Our hour is pretty much up. Gosh, that went quickly, didn't it? I think that I'm sorry if I didn't, for the audience members, I'm sorry if I didn't ask your question, but we're kind of out of time, unfortunately. But before I ask you to say thank you so much to our three wonderful contributors this evening, can I please draw your attention to another Wigtown Festival event, which is happening on Wednesday at 7 p.m, which is James Rebanks, whose new book, English Pastoral, has been published very recently, and he's in conversation with Galloway's very own Patrick Laurie about his new book at 7 p.m. So that's 7 p.m. on Wednesday, and details will be on the Wigtown Book Festival website tomorrow. Audience members, if I could invite you to take your cursors down and click on whoops, oh, you don't have that option. Oh, that's the devil. Okay, sometimes you have an option for a reaction, to do a little clapping hands. Julie's achieved it. I don't seem to have that function, however. But thank you so much to Karine. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you, Chitra. Thank you so very much indeed. Thank you. And thank you, Amanda. Thank you so very much indeed. Thank you. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Go well, stay safe, and thanks ever so much.